So good afternoon, everyone. I know it's after lunch is always the most exciting time of the day, especially for those who came from long distances and who may have jet lag. After lunch is always, think of it as morning for our friends who came from Europe. I know many have come from Europe and different parts of Asia. So it's wonderful to be here with you at this plenary session where we have several distinguished guests who are going to present papers. I'll introduce all of our speakers just in the order that they are on the program. And they'll present for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open things up for Q&A. First, we'll have Thomas Barfield from Boston University, who will present his paper before the nation, followed by Professor Nazif Shahrani from Indiana University, who will present From Empires to Rented Regimes. Then Saeed Reza Husseini from Princeton University will present Local Political Autonomy and Overlordship, followed by Hannah Hassani, who will talk about the formation of Khorasan. She's from St. Andrews University in UK. And last but definitely not least, we'll hear from Christian Blake Pye, who will speak on Ordering the World from Herat. So, Professor Barfield, the microphone. Oh, you're going up there. I can provide accompaniment if you'd like. But,
Is this on? Which?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. Well, I want to thank the organizers very much for putting together such a wonderful conference and to begin the afternoon. So I'm not going to use any PowerPoints at all. That way you won't know which points I skip. One of the things I want to discuss is going to begin with or end with why has Afghanistan had such a problem as a nation state. And one of the reasons I'll argue is that, in fact, Afghanistan's stability was in the past because it was never part of a nation state. It was always the part of an empire, somebody else's empire, somebody's own empire. But from the beginning of the first millennium BCE to the early 20th century, the politically dominant polities in Eurasia were not nation states, but immensely larger empires that ruled over a variety of peoples and places. Empires saw themselves as potentially universal and had frontiers rather than finite boundaries. Their founders were invariably outsiders who used military force to establish an empire, but whose successors maintained their stability by successfully managing the diversity within the empire. They often had lifespans measured in centuries, and their control of subject populations moved from initial coercion to forced co-optation to cooperation and finally identity. It is, which we can see like ancient Rome. If you read Asterix the Gaul, you know that nobody in France liked the Romans. On the other hand, once they installed baths and theaters in Rome, everybody said civilization has arrived. If France can hold those two ideas in mind, people of Afghanistan can hold at least that many as to who was our founders and what does it mean. Empires came in a variety of types, the most common of which were endogenous ones that financed their polities by extracting resources directly from the peoples that they ruled. Shared feature of the first ancient Persian, Chinese, Roman empires. But the important thing that I want to point out for Afghanistan is that these ancient empires had very different types of organization. Persia and China, for example, organized similar-sized empires, but employed remarkably different templates to do so. Persia used a Lego block empire design in which every part was tightly bound to the center, but each parts were different, and they could be reassembled another way. China chose to melt down its dispersed parts and recast them into a single uniform state. Chinese dynasties invariably employed centralized appointed rulers with no ties to the local people that they ruled over, and enforced a single system of law using a standardized language, or at least language script, knowledge of which was a prerequisite for government service. By contrast, although their empires were also ruled by dynastic autocrats, The Persian decentralized king of kings systems respected indigenous cultural traditions, employed conquered elites using local language to administer their own people under imperial supervision. Persian levels of tolerance were even higher for peoples inhabiting their sparsely populated desert and mountain lands that they ruled indirectly and only rarely taxed, a policy Chinese state builders would undoubtedly seen as a programming bug rather than a feature of how to run an empire. One reason for this was geographical. Persian empires were lumpy, with their highly populated and economically productive zones separated by mountains and deserts. China, by contrast, was highly populated and economically productive in contiguous states that didn't vary that much from one another and were linked together by canals and roads. Another was cultural. The populations of Chinese empire shared a common culture with only small differences and accounted people different from themselves only in frontier areas. Persian empires, by contrast, ruled over peoples with their own languages, religions, and deeply rooted political traditions different from both their overlords and other groups within the empire. China strove to assimilate non-Han people that came under the empire's control. Persia never attempted to impose its Zoroastrian religion or language on others and regularly made gestures to support local religious institutions. The reasons this is important, even though it's like 2,500 years ago, is the Persian template was extremely durable, lasting from the founding of the Achaemenid Empire in 550 BCE until the collapse of the Sasanian Empire in 651 current CE, with only one break, Alexander, whose Macedonians rule for about a century. And if we look at what happens after that, that's close to 1 millennium of a Persian style of government with the same kind of elite ruling over the area of today's Afghanistan, as well as much of the area around it. But if we look at what we see as a watershed moment of the Islamic Caliphate taking over, what we see is with the reorganization of the Islamic Caliphate under the Abbasids and the creation of the capital in Baghdad, who are the people that dominate the government? The caliph may have been an Arab, but everybody knows, at least certainly in this room, that it was the people from Khorasan that brought down the Umayyads, that created Baghdad and ruled it. And who were their prime ministers? The Barkamids, descendants of a family that used to run the shrine in Balkh. What this shows was, in essence, and it's a shift, the cultural ideology of this region shifts from central Iran to today's Khorasan, which unfortunately the Iranians continue to call Eastern Iran, but we know better. But if we look at what we see here, this model, even after the collapse of the caliphates, is taken over by the Safavids, the Samovids, but more importantly, by the Turco-Mongolian people. Beginning around 1000 AD with the introduction of the Seljuks into the region, we find a new system of government coming in, and that is a creation, a dual government, where a dynasty of Turkish horse riding ancestry coming out of Central Asia conquers a region and then realizes it can't rule it. Who does it rely to rule on it, to rule for it? Persian-speaking, literate bureaucrats. And we get, from this point of view, a political organization that the Sultan, the Emir, whoever, what title we want to call him, divides the state between men of the sword, usually Turks, and men of the pen, Persians. It's a dual organization, bureaucratic, military. But what it means is a dynastic organization, and it doesn't matter who's on top. Whether it's Persian, Turkish, or later Pashtun, the rulers at the top are in charge, but the people doing the administration have local skills, local cultures. So what does this mean for the peoples currently inhabiting Afghanistan? And I talk about the peoples currently inhabiting Afghanistan because the problem of all national states is they like to write their history as if you take the boundaries of today and extend them into the Paleolithic. Like early Uzbek hunters of the 5th century BC. Well, you may have had hunters, they may have been in today's Uzbekistan, but they certainly weren't Uzbeks. Indeed, it's a problem. Any of you who visit Uzbekistan will note that the founder of the Uzbek Empire was Shaybani Khan. Every statue that you see in Tashkent is Timur. Timur is not Uzbek. Yeah, but he's not much of a charismatic. He's more charismatic than, if you want to go on the world stage, pick Timur. Everybody has heard of Timur. And fortunately, if you're not too local, you won't say, isn't he not like Uzbek? Weren't the Uzbeks not even here? Yeah. But this is an example. You pick your heroes, you pick your poets. Uzbekistan's greatest poets, how come they all write in Persian? Again, it's because you are taking the local pieces and putting it together. And what we find is that in Afghanistan, the name regions of Afghanistan, Herat, Balkh, Kandahar, Kabul, Peshawar, these were all provinces of the ancient Persian Empire. And they have been remarkably durable. I mean, incredible. That's 2,500 years durable. One of the reasons they're durable is each has its own identity and its own central place. Even when that place is destroyed, like Herat or Balkh, it comes back. And the local people have their own identities. They are the Lego blocks of empires. And the question is not when are we getting our own empire or why can't we rule by ourselves? It's how do we fit into the system? And why they found it useful was all of these empires knew that they could not rule unless they had the cooperation of the local people. So what we find is systems of government that even if the emperor sends one of his sons out to be governor, he has to work through the local elite. And in many cases, you wouldn't even send your son out, probably because you couldn't trust him. You relied on members of the local elite to rule for you. It also meant that when an empire fell or collapsed, you might find yourself in another empire. If we look at today's Afghanistan, we find Kabul and Peshawar, they're part of the Mughal Empire. We find Herat, part of the Persian Empire. And the Uzbeks are taking the north. But the regions remain the same. They keep their identity the same. And sometimes they're part of a single empire altogether. Sometimes they're edges of frontiers, but they're remarkably, remarkably durable. Even when they're imperial capitals. Herat and Kabul both had the luxury at one period of being capitals, one of the Timurid Empire, one of the Mughal Empire, where they received imperial patronage. When that empire lost, went away or whatever, the old system came back with much better potential ruins perhaps, but they never lost their identity because it was the imperial government sitting on top of them, but it never wiped out their own identity. Now, the fact that this lasted so long brings up the question, what does it mean for the peoples inhabiting Afghanistan today? The core regions of Afghanistan, not the provinces of Afghanistan that seem to keep expanding under the Republic, but the core regions of Afghanistan. They didn't, colloquially, if you talk about Herat, people kind of think, yeah, that's the West. Kandahar, that's the South. Balkh, that's the North. Because they are the urban centers of whole regions that often have a variety of different ethnic groups, different types of economies, but these core regions continued to act as autonomous and independent entities, or at least autonomous entities. This ends with Emir Abdurrahman. When he becomes Emir, what he does is decide, I not only want a centralized government, I don't want any intermediaries. I want to be in charge. So first he crushes the Pashtuns. Then he crushes everybody else. And then announces, it's a Pashtun state. Well, he had destroyed them first. The thing is, it wasn't a Pashtun state. He happened to be a Pashtun, and he was in charge. He had to create his own elite. The Mohammad's-I mean, it was like, were they elite before he became? No, they weren't like conquering heroes. He needs an elite. He creates one. That problem, however, meant that the rest of Afghanistan was put off cycle because it meant Kabul over everything, but also a desire to create uniformity. Now, Abdurrahman, as much as he wanted centralization, was pretty much focused on political and military centralization. What his successor, particularly Amanullah, was interested in, having declared Afghanistan's independence, was how do I create a nation state. Because that was the fashion of the 20th century. I mean, Italy become a nation state, Germany become a nation state. We should be a nation state too. The problem is that looking at what a nation state is and how it comes about is that Afghanistan was not really designed and could almost not be put into that pattern. He would like to go back to the famous work by Benedict Anderson on how do you get national states. And he gave three things that he said caused the rise of ethno-national states in Europe. Also elsewhere, one could see similar things in China. First of all, sacred communities. The unifying power of religion, like Christianity or the Islamic Ummah, had been eroded, he said, by the rise of secular thought and the Protestant Reformation. Two, dynastic realms. Rule by divinely ordained monarchs was losing its legitimacy, replaced by a focus on the sovereignty of the people. Third, an a priori language. The privileged underlying language of power and literacy, like Latin, were replaced with vernaculars, creating both linguistic barriers and opportunities for new identities. These are things that come into existence in the 18th century. By the 19th century, they're taking over, particularly this idea that sovereignty lies with the people, not with the rulers. But if we look at all of these three things that Anderson said, yeah, it's the loss of these things that bring about a nation state. Afghanistan never lost any of them. Okay, let's go back to the first, the sacred communities. One has to say, looking past 40, 50 years, the history of Afghanistan, that Islam being used as unity for political purposes has hardly lost its grip on both the cultural and political imagination of Afghanistan. The idea of crusade or the wars between Protestants and Catholics may have been seen as passé in Western Europe, but not so much in Afghanistan. Islam was very, very strong. It was hardly archaic. People were hardly looking for a secular alternative to replace something that was failing. Ask the PDPA. Second, dynastic realms. Anderson said, well, there's a problem with rule by divinely ordained monarchs. The one thing Afghans never, and even their rulers, none of them thought they were divinely ordained. They changed too often. I mean, they could change for breakfast. Islam in general, but Afghanistan in particular, God might be on your side, but he certainly didn't put you on the throne. That simply is not there. And it says replaced by a focus on the sovereignty of the people. There was no political movement in Afghanistan that said, you know what, we're missing a sovereignty of the people. If anything, including the last president of the republic, sovereignty relied in the king, the emirs, the comrade, general, you name it. It was the government that was sovereign, not the people, in terms of thinking. Therefore, elections were not a case of the people expressing their sovereignty. It was kind of, oh, somebody's got to be leader. It was ratifying a decision that was already made. It was not an expression of sovereignty. So if that's the problem, if the belief that dynasty doesn't work, that's not a problem that exists in Afghanistan. And the best example of this is post-2001, when King Zahir Shah returns to Afghanistan. And the question is, Bonner said, yeah, Karzai would make a very good leader of Afghanistan. And when the king showed up, they said the king would make even better. And if Khalilzad hadn't had such sharp elbows and probably a gun at the king's back, I do not want to be king, Afghanistan would have welcomed a king back. Made it really difficult with the Taliban. How do you kill out an infidel king from your own area? They're lucky it wasn't done. And this actually happened in Europe. When Franco died, leading a fascist state in Spain, he turned the government over to a king who nursed it into democracy because both the left and the right could agree, okay, we can put up with a king, we can't put up with each other. The belief that dynastic rule is invalid or no longer has relevance has not been true in Afghanistan. And so the belief that we have to go to a new system, even during the time I remember being in Peshawar, talking with the Mujahideen people, Their great fear was that Zahir Shah might visit the refugee camps. And who was somebody like Sayyaf? Who was somebody like Rabbani compared to King Zahir Shah? And besides, everybody knows he ruled a golden age. For those of us who were in Afghanistan when it was there, it was no golden age when his cousin, it was like, but everything gets better in retrospect if things get more horrible. But the final thing is a priori language. This was a really interesting thing, is that Anderson said, okay, Latin, a universal language for Europe coming out of the church, a religious language, begins to decline and is replaced by vernacular languages. You know what? In Afghanistan, they had done that 1,000 years earlier. The sacred language of Islam, Arabic, is moved to the religious side, and Persian becomes not only the lingua franca, it's the administrative language. And you don't have to be a Persian speaker to appreciate its value. Every single ruler, almost all of whom were Turks, including Babur, who founds the Mughal dynasty, makes Persian their language of administration. And everyone knows in Afghanistan, even if it's not your first language, it's a very common lingua franca. And unlike other languages in other places, you might not be literate in Persian, but you could speak it. So what we have in Afghanistan is not, and this was a problem for those who said, we will make Pashto the national language. There already was a national language that was not directly connected with an ethnic group. Yes, Tajiks might speak Persian, so do Hazaras. But Pashto as a language, Pashto as a people, they're linked together. Persian was, well, that's like everybody does that, including, it must be noted, Daoud Khan and Zahir Shah. Daoud Khan, who was a great proponent of Pashtun nationalism, cannot speak Pashto. There's plenty of nationalists that don't meet all the criteria. Hitler was an Austrian, not a German. But the fact is that if you're trying to build a national identity and you're trying to make the default Pashtun, it doesn't fit. And it doesn't fit not because the Pashtuns were dominant politically. They were dominant politically when they were a dynasty. But declare that you're dominant because we are a nation state with a default of Pashtun just doesn't stick. What you can and does work is to say that people of Afghanistan do see themselves as a single nation. It's not an ethno-national nation. All you have to do to see that is refugees that went to Iran, refugees that went to Pakistan, they knew it was a different kind of place, or Central Asia. And I said that ethno-nationalism is it's a romantic endeavor. It's often spearheaded by poets. This is who we are. We should sing a national anthem. We should do this. We should do that. And I'd like to point out that Afghanistan has the lowest divorce rate practically in the world. It's a land of arranged marriages. We stay together for the family, okay? And they have historically taken the same attitude towards building the state. You don't have to love it to make it work. You don't have to identify to make it work. One of your people does not have to be in charge to make it work. But should you take the ideology of you must identify with the leader and his particular ethnicity, then you're getting into trouble because you're going against the grain. The other thing you're going against the grain is an attempt to make uniformity, that the basic units of Afghanistan, Bal, Herat, Kandahar, Kabul, are still there and make the capacity for running a country in a way that, yeah, there is a central government that has sovereignty, but let the locals do what they want. People are more conservative than Mazar in Kandahar than Mazar, so be it. As I've said, in the United States, we have the oldest federal republic. Hope we keep it up. But I'm from Massachusetts. What do I have in common with the people of Alabama? And I look at some of the laws they pass, say, by God, no. But I don't live in Alabama, okay? And they don't live in Boston. But if I were an American Ashraf Ghani or Donald Trump, and I put Ivanka as governor of California, or Jared, the governor of Massachusetts, we'd have an insurgency too. That was what was happening in Afghanistan, particularly at the end of the republic. is the lack of respect for what people wanted and running a patrimonial system when you didn't have the base to make it work. That was bringing it down. And it was not because Afghanistan was a failed nation state. It was because the nation state project was poorly designed and had now, over the course of 100 years, collapsed 4 times. So I'll leave it at that, just in terms of that was then, and our question of what's to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I guess we have you on the record as supporting Ivanka as the next governor of California. It has been written. Thank you, Professor Shahrani.
How do I do this with this? Okay. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa bihi nasta'in. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon to everybody. Let me also thank the organizers of ALPA and all the supporters of that organization for making this possible. This is my first time at ALPA gatherings, and it's a pleasure to see so many young Afghan scholars here. It truly is an amazing experience for me, being here for over 50 years and being in gatherings where maybe there were no more than 1 or 2 Afghans. And now we have a critical mass, and it's a pleasure, and congratulations to all of you for being here and carrying on. I'm going to take slightly different take, focusing on the political economy of state and also technologies of power that has made Afghanistan what a mess it is. Let me start with the period of imperial rule, at least specifically with association of name Afghanistan to a geography, starting with 1747. What was the political economy of this state like, this imperial state that is? One of the most important theories and the most elegant theories that I have come across was formulated 1,000 years ago by Yusuf Khas Hajib Balsaghuni. A very elegant, very simple, but extremely relevant to modern day Afghanistan, which has to do again with political economy of state stability. He simply says, troops are needed to maintain the state, then and now. Wealth is needed to pay the troops. A prosperous people is needed to collect the wealth. And for the people to be prosperous, justice must be maintained. A very key issue indeed. And it says any of these things is lacking or missing, then the state will fall apart. Keep that in mind, that how important that theory is and why we haven't been able to, well, it's not moving, not doing anything. The slide is moving. Now it is, okay. The Muslim empires of faith obviously had 2 very key issues. One was to essentially claim that they are expanding and protecting Islam and Islamic domain. But the second very important thing was occasionally talked about justice. Whether justice was there or not, what was critical was that they claimed they were defenders of Islam. But in addition to that, what really made successful empires successful were these 5 other things that were really part of the technology of power of the era. The first one was Zar. These are very critical in how things have happened. that is extracting wealth mostly by war, loot, and some taxation and so on and so forth. So the ones who were successful did that. Zur was the use of force. How many could you get to come to the wars for loot or for otherwise? And it was critical. The one tribesman and others who could, that Tom referred to. The other one was Zan, strategic alliance of marriages. And of course, this is part of the problem that we're also dealing with gender issues today, that women were commoditized and also turned into weapon of political manipulations and all the rest, which is with us. The other very important thing was Zamin, land. Land was also used as a way of recruiting essentially support for the ruler by granting them land or by granting them taxation, the right of taxation to the land. And that, of course, created a very important mechanism for having power. The last but not least, which is not Z, but it's T, and that's Tazwir. Tazwir is one of the critical technologies of power and has been in the region, because here you deceive people by instrumentalizing religion. Instrumentalized both by the rulers and by religious leaders who are also, of course, recruited to help them do that. And this collaboration with Sufis, with others, of course, has been part of this technology of power, which one has to keep in mind. The result has been sovereignty of rulers who managed to keep people is rayat and is taba'a. These concepts are very extremely important because these are subjects without rights. They are essentially, as Tom was referring to, it is also very important. So what happened in 1880? This is the part of our political culture. What I'm emphasizing is that this political culture that produced the imperial age also continued with certain transformation and certain wiggling, as it were, but not really going away, not being changed very much. And the first one, of course, was that religion, the Tazwir, continued. And of course, modern day Taliban is the worst form of that Tazwir. You will come to back to that. The other thing was jihad. The concept of jihad has been also part of this Tazwir by rulers in the era that since 1880, again, Abdurrahman just did not come to power on his own. He was brought into power, crowned by outsiders, and given the weapons and the money to do what he was made essentially to make it possible. One of the very interesting things about Zan, the political asylum, what do you call alliances, the marriage alliances, was slightly transformed. Those went on, but not in the same level as in the 19th century, certainly not before 1880. They created a new institution. It was called Ghulam Bachagani Darbar. Instead of marriage alliances, they essentially brought young men of powerful families as hostages, essentially, to the court and made them put them into the service of the royal court. And the implications that has not been studied very much, but it's a very important development in terms of technology of power that Afghanistan has experienced. The last, Zarin Zur, is very critical. Zarin Zur used to be by war, loot, and a whole bunch of other things. It shifted critically, that it became provided by enemies of the country, enemies of the people of Afghanistan, but the friends of the rulers. they essentially give them the money, the weapons, and all the rest to rule. And of course, that's what we know is وابستگی به استعمار. It's something that has stayed with us since 1880. And the example, I don't have a lot of time to go, but the slide shows you when UK was the provider of the means for the rulers. And in World War II, a new phenomenon happened. Until World War II, essentially UK was the provider. After World War II, something new happened in the world political scene, and that's empires by invitation and empires by trust, which are these empires are based on making other countries dependent on the ones who provide. And of course, the best example is this country where I live. And of course, we saw the impact of that recently by what President Trump did. You pull the plug, everybody screams. And you want to do whatever you want to do, essentially, because the world has become dependent. And you can manipulate it as you wish. And then USSR, of course, the Cold War was dependency had two sides, a bipolar world. Some were dependent on the USSR, some on USA and the European West, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, we have the proxy war era, where you find, the 1980s is not just USSR, also Mujahideen became dependent. The jihad was essentially sidetracked by US and Arabia and others. Then the proxy wars of the 1990s, and then the last part, of course, US intervention for 20 years. And the very last, of course, is the Taliban are not free of not being dependent. They're totally dependent on US money, the $40-something million a week that they have been paid, and a lot of other things. What's also interesting is, if you haven't read this book, please do take a look at it, Funding the Enemy. What the empires, by invitation or empires of trust, do is they're not only supporting their friends, they support their enemies also. US needs strong enemies, powerful enemies. Powerful countries don't fight little kids, you don't kick them on the road. You have to show them it's big and important, and even give them money and weapons. This book documents essentially how United States actually supported their enemies in the war. What has all of this produced in terms of our political culture? Political culture of violence. All political successions in Afghanistan have been fascinatingly violent. We have had 16 leaders in the country. And amongst the 16 things, 4 of them were violently assassinated or killed while in power. 7 of them were violently removed from power. 2 of those who were removed from power were also violently killed. We have had only 2 leaders who died natural death in their beds, Abdurrahman Khan and Mujaddidi. And 3 of them are still alive. So you look at this and you know what kind of a mess of a country we have been living in. And the reason is quite obvious. We have also had 9 constitutions in a little over 100 years. Constitutions are weaponized for centralization of power and for assuring those who are in power that they can have. Why should a country in 100 years have 9 constitutions? Everybody made their own constitutions for themselves to assure their rule. Not for the country, not for the nation. As Tom was referring to, if people were something that anybody was concerned with, then the constitutions should have been very different. These are weapons. In fact, I had read once a manuscript about Central Asia, which is lying with constitution. A lot of constitutions are lies in our part of the world. And of course, These, not that I'm saying that we don't need constitutions, we need them, but we need them slightly differently than we are. The other very important thing, this has created this crisis of trust. Our society suffers from buhrani i'timad, in a worst form. And of course, the reason for that is tafawuq talabi, or essentially claiming greater rights by everybody. Every individual, every ethnic group, every family, whatever, they want more. They should have more than the other guys. And that's where the crisis of trust comes. Tazweer, again, instrumentalization of religion continues. And even democracy that came as an ideology or brought in as an ideology in the country has been also part of this deception, part of Tazweer. It is not truly democracy. We haven't experienced it. We have had, obviously, elections and this and that, but that's part of the, again, game of deception in our society. The other very important thing, of course, is this oppression of women, gender, khushunati jinsiyati, which has been part and parcel of our family life. It's not something new. It's embedded in our families. Is a most important unit of social organization in society. We are leaving that, and we're talking about essentially woman, 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 woman. Woman is part of a family. That's unit, clearly an important one. Without man in that unit changing and understanding different kind of values, you're not going to change a woman. Woman's status is not going to change. It doesn't matter how many NGOs you produce, how many projects you get. You have to change the family. And that's the product of this political culture for so long that has brought us to here. And ultimately, of course, the worst part of that is this extreme dependency on outside. Money outside everything. And that's going to be the vicious circle that has produced this dysfunctional political culture that we are grappling with. We need to change this cycle, this political culture. If we don't, there is no hope of either woman becoming somebody with its own right, or man, or anybody else in the country. So the political system also has produced a whole lot of horrible things that we have experienced, and that is autocratic rule, and it has introduced discrimination, nepotism, cronyism, corruption. All of these are part of a cultural, political culture that they need to be addressed. They need to be fixed. If we don't find solutions to these problems, we're not going to be able to do much of anything. The outcome of this has been, we had a society that was different, it had different segments, linguistically, sectarian-wise, regionally, and so forth. These differences have been transformed into social fragmentation. Those social fragmentations have been now turned into violent factions that fight each other and produce violence, and that needs to be addressed. The worst thing is that we have not had a government that is sovereign, not in the history of this country that we're talking about. We have had hukumatoi ijarai wa hukumatoi kirai, leased governments. These are leased because, as earlier slides showed you, different forces have provided them with that. So when you have leased governments with power, they are not going to be able to need any authority. Authority comes from people empowering somebody. We have never had, because the governments have had the weapons they needed, the ideology they needed, everything else. So there has been no need for turning Taba'ai and Rayat into Shahrwand. Because of that, we don't have Shahrwand in Afghanistan. And that's what we're living with until now. They have also weaponized Islam and weaponized all ideologies, whether it was communism, socialism, or anything else. They are weapons in the hands of rulers, again, in collaboration with colonial powers, with imperial powers from the outside. And that's why much of what we don't have today is the reality. I wanted to just say this one quotation from de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. He had said, America took the state out of forcing or coercing public conformity to religion, okay? But not religion out of the public life. And what did they do for us in Afghanistan? They essentially empowered the Taliban to coerce, enforce religion on people in Afghanistan. And the process has been that religion has been taken out of our society. People are turning away from Islam. They don't want to have anything. If this is Islam, I don't want it. Forget it. The reverse of what Tocqueville said about America more than 100 years ago, in the 19th century. And we are brought to that point where our religion is forced upon us by shallaq every day. And of course, the reality is that. And I just wanted to say, if you haven't read Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the new book that is translated, this is Haqqani's book, by Dr. Saleh, please read it. This is a manifesto of Taliban where they claim that Amir Haybatullah is Janishini Khuda. Can you imagine a Muslim saying that some leader is essentially a replacement for God, or in his essentially representative on earth? Does God need a representation on earth? Or someone standing for him? The Quran says he is closer to us than our jugular vein. Does somebody who is closer to you than your jugular vein need somebody to represent them on earth? And if you don't obey, this book says, if you don't obey, then you are gunahgar. Where is we? Gunah is in front of God, not in front of some human being. Maybe according to their law, you will be a criminal, but you're not gunahgar. Gunah is a very different concept. So where is this book? And it's being translated apparently by somebody named Lucian something. I just met him in Vienna. He's going to translate it from Arabic into English. So it'll be an eye-opener for the rest of the world to read. Where do they come from? And this is a government that has been imposed on us, and the power has been handed over by none other than the United States of America. This is the political economy of modern world that has created these dependencies in imperial ages, American empire, and European empire, Chinese empire, maybe soon in others, or essentially creating dependencies of small countries around the world, which we're not going to be able to kick easily out of our lives. And the technology of power that locals are using also is another enemy. We have to grapple with both of them. Shaking both of these things are not going to happen very easily, but we must have some vision of providing solutions to these problems of political culture. Otherwise, it's going to be a very difficult path indeed. And thank you very much. Don't know. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So I'll try to be a little bit faster because we have, I'm in time. So thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for such a great conference. Of course, adding a panel on history. So this is like really a rare thing that's happening. And Professor Bartol already said a lot about the empire and the framework we have. So basically, I'm just going to fill the details in that sense. And I'm talking how basically this framework really worked in Afghanistan. In his insightful books, Shadow Empires and Afghanistan, which I'm sure that you're all familiar with, Professor Thomas Bartol highlighted several key issues crucial for understanding the historical background of state formation in the region now known as Afghanistan. In this presentation, I will briefly revisit those issues and examine some primary materials related to the political structure and administration produced in Afghanistan. These primary sources not only confirm the framework of state discussed by Barfield, but also demonstrate how different rulers successfully managed Afghanistan's complex society in the past, which now presents almost impossible or very difficult to govern. In his Shadow Empires, I just basically remind you of what Professor was talking about. In his Shadow Empires, Barfield observes that Afghanistan was often part of an indigenous empire, such as the Persians, and I should actually say that it's Achaemenids, Parthians, and the Sasanians, or an exogenous empires like the Turco-Mongolians. And I should add to this the Greeks, Arabs, Huns, and others that Professor Barfield already elaborated in his book about them. These two types of empires had different political structures that extended to Afghanistan. The Persians had the king of king system, or the Shah and Shah system, he already mentioned, which that doesn't move. Oh, yeah. The Persians had the king of king or Shah and Shah system, which suited the Iranian empire's diverse geography, uneven production capacity, and different populations. The Iranian system emerged through, and I quote, a process of internal development and outward expansion, end of quote, incorporating local kings into the imperial system, forming a symbiotic relationship between the center and the subordinate kings. The local kings were not treated as subject of the emperor, but as friend of the Shah and Shah through the ritual of gift giving, paying tributes, and performing services. That relation was understood as an, and I quote again, integral component of the empire's scheme of governance, end of quote. The result was the political stability of the Iranian Empire that protected all kinds of cultural traditions. This type of empire could fall only by an external power, or you can say external invasion, which we already know about. The exogenous or shadow empire was often founded by the nomadic pastoralists with a different social composition. The best example are the steppe empires. Barfield notes that this type of empire, and I quote, political and military structures were designed to extract the economic resources, end of quote, produced outside of the steppes. In other words, the nomadic states' internal revenue deficit required extracting external resources through organizing military campaigns in resourceful regions like North China or India or Eastern Europe. Once they controlled them, the nomadic states paid the utmost attention to political stability in those regions to maintain the flow of wealth to the steppe, to maintain basically their states there. Can you go to the next one, please? Next one, and the next one. And the next one. Oh, yeah. Unlike the Persian empires, the nature of the state in the steppe empires was hierarchical, with the Khaqan at the top of the structure, who reorganized the nomadic society, usually in decimal form, with a military and, if required, a civil administration. In this system, the local kings were not friends of the Khaqan, but were considered as chief within the hierarchical political structure, which we actually have the Il-Tabar or Il-Tabar, sources. Despite their differences in both indigenous and exogenous systems, the overlords, Shah and Shah, Khaqan, needed the cooperation of the local kings, which allowed local kings to keep their positions. Although the local kings managed their own civil administration, collected taxes, enforced social justice, and commanded their troops, they acknowledged the authority of the overlords. The representative of the overlords were based in the region's most important cities like Mar, Balkh, Bukhara, and Herat. Being friends or chiefs to the overlord, they allowed the local kings to access imperial resources and political prestige. Barfield describes that this political structure as the Swiss cheese model, also talked about the Lego blocks, where the imperial administration only controlled the most resourceful parts, mostly the OSS cities, and left other areas to the local rulers. This model allowed the continuation of local governance without being dictated by the central administration. The existing primary materials confirm that Afghanistan was indeed part of both indigenous and exogenous systems, either separately or simultaneously. These materials indicate that local political autonomy and overlordship was the main form of political structure that persisted in Afghanistan for over 2 millennia, from the Achaemenids to the Durrani period, and only changed during the Barakzai period. This political structure created a space for a symbiotic relationship between local governance and central administration over time. It also fostered harmonious relationship among different groups of people from various cultural and religious backgrounds. Here, I briefly discuss some of these sources and leave the rest of them to discussion. A direct report of local political autonomy and overlordship is documented by the Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang, who crossed Afghanistan in 630 CE en route to India. He mentions that this region, the region north of the Hindu Kuh, known as Hindu Kush today, is called Tuhulo and Tukharistan, had 27 autonomous states whose rulers independently governed their areas. Nevertheless, they recognized the authority of the Turkish Khaqan. Xuanzang observes that the diversity of geography of this region and the lack of royal authority prevented political unification under a single ruler. Certainly, his understanding of political unification reflected political centralization in the Chinese model, or in the Chinese context that Professor Barfield already spoke about. Xuanzang notes that Tukharistan, Badakhshan, Bamiyan, Kapisa, Kabul, and Lamaghan, called Laghman today, had different principalities with diverse populations who followed various religious traditions, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, Hindus, and so on. Yet they all lived together peacefully, and even their religious places were near each other. Another Buddhist pilgrim called Hei Chao, a Korean one, who visited this region in 725 CE, observes the same political structure, but under the Arab overlordship. So this is basically when the Abbasids are around. Please go to the next one. And the next one. Further information on local political autonomy and overlordship is reflected in the Bactrian documents found in the northern part of the Hindu Kuh, Khesh in Bamiyan, and Khost in the southern part of the Hindu Kuh, or Hindu Kush. They vary from administrative letters, economic contracts, and legal documents, and were produced between the early 4th and late 8th centuries. This extensive period covers the Sasanians, Kedarites, Hephthalites, Turks, Umayyads, and the early Abbasids, or in other words, both indigenous and exogenous empires. The documents are written in Arya, it's called Arya Watch, or Zabani Ari, the only Middle Iranian language written in Greek script, known also as Balkhi or Bactrian today. In general, the documents show that these regions, or northern part of Hindu Kush, were controlled by local principalities independently, but they all recognized the overlordship of an overlord. In other words, local governments and central administration worked together. And because of time now, I can't actually go to all of them, so I just say and show some of them. Can you go to the next one, please? And basically, this is what, anyway, so Professor Barfield talking about the Swiss cheese, and you actually can see it when you put documents together. The documents from Bactria reflect the local administration in this region. For instance, Guzgan, Rob, and Gaz and Karagistan, all in northern part of Hindu Kush, near Bamiyan and around, had different kings called Khuda, Khar, Sher, or Ser, and Karakbet. These kings had local lineage and managed their areas with the help of local authorities called Khuv, or Khui sometimes. Administratively, each area was divided into several units: city, districts, village, and the fortresses in the mountainous regions. The village foreman, called Kardar or Sarlar in the documents, collected taxes in cash and coin called Harb, Tog, and Rozik, or Rizqa later in Arabic, which were assessed by the local fiscal office, supervised by the district governor or Framalar, later Farmadar, Farmandar nowadays, from these regions. They collected taxes they collected taxes were the main source of income, apart from the trade, to maintain the local government and local forces led by a commander called Les Bed. Later we call it Kotwal in basically Persian sources. The cities and district had local police called Les Bed, Dejbed, later Sahib al-Shorta in Arabic, who commanded different units to maintain law and order. The local king benefited from the local council led by an advisor who's really, say, a studied person, usually called Andar's Bed. If two major political power competed over control of this region, the local rulers often switched their allegiance to the victorious party and paid tributes. In the case of disputes between these local rulers, they visited the overlords and accepted his judgment. And then you can clearly see these two documents basically from Bactria, and they show how they basically shift the allegiance from one to another overlord. And I put them basically in Bactrian, in Persian, also the English translation from Nicholas Sims Williams, you can clearly see from Kazakhstan. Next one, please. Bactrian documents demonstrate that all decisions, legal, economic, familiar, were made at the local level in the presence of local people as witnesses. And this is a very important issue. Higher authorities were informed through written letters circulated by the political, by the postal system called basically Fritik that time. While issues were processed locally, people had access to the local king in case they were oppressed by the local authorities and they expected justice. As I have shown in another place, local people perceived justice as the government's sole responsibility to protect their lives, property, and social dignity. And this is also very important. Although people adhere to local, say, to different religious traditions, Buddhists, Hindus, Zoroastrians, and so, and the priest had royal patronage, and then also very important in the society, this political system did not permit any religious authority to serve as a judge or enforce social justice. And this is really unique. You can, see that is happening in that region. How many minutes do I have? It's almost
unfortunately.
over. Okay. So, right. Okay. So then I think I'll leave the rest all, to discussion, and then, allow the other members to talk. So what basically we have this local autonomy and, overlordship, as I showed, in the, say, the documents, you can clearly see that this continues even when the Arabs come, they take over this region, the whole basically, northern part, and then, later central and south of Afghanistan. So this continues under the Caliphate, or they say the Caliphal system. So can you go to the next one, please? Oh, so these are a little bit. Yeah, so basically this is just the system I brought out from the documents. You can clearly see that, the region had a precise, very sophisticated, local system that they work very well together. So this is basically people say is not governable, is very governable. Afghanistan is very governable, but depends how you approach it. Go to the next one, please. And then by this, can see by basically the almost the Abbasid, period. So you can see whether the Samanids, the Ghaznavids, Khwarezmshahids, whoever were there as, say, overlord, the overarching, say, power, they were always local kings, and then usually called Shahanshah Khurasan or Shah Khurasan, Malik Mashriq or whatever. And then you can see the local kings. For example, this is the king of Guzgan, Ahmad ibn Muhammad Fariguni. So he minted his coin, but he's basically under the overlordship of the king of the Samanids, and the king of Saman is under the overlordship of the Khalifa. But then you see the different areas in Guzgan, like basically, 10 different regions, different areas, they all had their own local authorities who used to do their job, properly. And go to the next one, please. The last one. And then, even with the later when we have the Ghaznavids and others, pre-Mongols, and this goes basically to the Mongols and the Timurids. So the government has its own central administration with the Divan or the ministries, yet the local rulers have their own administration they have. So in a way, the local rulers basically work together. The central, say, local governance is there. The central administration is there. They're working together, but central administration does not do anything to disrupt the local, say, administration. And I guess, this is the key that I wanted to emphasize. Probably the last one, just to show it, and then that's, and yeah, that's over. So I'll leave it, to the discussion. Thank you.
But I still know what I'm going to say, and if I could just have someone else with that second letter, yeah, and then we'll cover, luckily it's still in here, or it's in here.
So we have about 15 minutes.
You have the PowerPoint over there? Okay. So thank you all for having me here at this conference and for listening to my talk. So I'm here to speak about ordering the world from Herat, sacred kingship and governance in Timurid Khorasan. So for those studying pre-modern Afghanistan, when it was more often than not under the rule of Turkic sultanates, the nature of Islamic sovereignty and theory of practice has been a prevailing concern. Nowhere is this subject more salient than in the study of the Timurid Empire, once unified from the edge of China to Anatolia, but fragmented after the death of Timur the Conqueror. In this context, theories of sovereignty, which sought to sacralize rulers as both perfect humans and philosopher kings, were in high demand among the competing sons of Timur, who attempted to justify their claims to universal rule. This was the state of political theory when the Timurid Empire was at its apogee. But today I will trace the Timurids' political philosophy from their peak to when they were at their end in the late 15th century. I will conclude by addressing the relationship, or lack thereof, between that philosophy and governance in Timurid Khorasan during the reign of Sultan Hussein Paikara. But before getting directly to Herat and Khorasan under Sultan Hussein, I want to talk a little bit more about what I mean by Timurid political philosophy. The Timurids lived in an era when politics were post-Caliphal, meaning that political innovations of the time responded to the end of the centuries enduring Abbasid Caliphate in 1258. Based in Baghdad, the Abbasids were significant because they remained essential components of Islamic sovereignty well after losing nearly all effective authority. Although it was a Sunni political institution, for instance, the Shi'i Boyyids had preserved the caliphate and used them in political rituals, even as they took control of all Abbasid lands in the 10th and 11th centuries. This pattern continued with the Sunni Seljuks and other sultanates from the 11th century onward. In effect, as Asfar Muin has argued, the Abbasid caliphs lost all power in exchange for becoming a sacred object, a desired relic in the contest of Islamic sovereignty. In this way, the caliphate sanctified as rightful Muslim sultans those rulers who had come to rule through force and conquest. This paradigm concluded when the Mongol Hulagu Khan killed the caliph in 1258. Thereafter, descent from Chinggis Khan became a necessity for rulership across Muslim Asia, even until the reign of Timur. Timur himself ruled as a royal son-in-law through his marriage to a Chinggisid princess. Moreover, he claimed only to be the emir or general of the true ruler, a Chinggisid Khan who had come to perform much the same function as the Abbasid caliph once had. This changed once again with the descendants of Timur, who made their progenitor their new model of sovereignty, but not as a mere conqueror. They took advantage of the idea, which first took root while Timur was still alive, that Timur was the lord of auspicious conjunction, or Sahib Kiran, an astrological messiah who would usher in a new dispensation. In this schema, Timur was ordained by God through the intermediation of the planets and stars. In repeating this term as Timur's primary title, the courtier intellectuals of the Timurid princes assured that this sanctity would also be ascribed to his descendants, but in terms increasingly Islamicized and Neoplatonized. It was not enough for Timur to be a lord of conjunction. His descendants had to become Sufic, Neoplatonic, and Islamic messiahs themselves. Iskandar Mirza, who briefly ruled over the Western Timurid Empire from the city of Shiraz, for instance, articulated himself as a philosopher king with preternatural knowledge of all the traditional and intellectual sciences of Islam, a chief scholar among the many scholars that he gathered to his court. And he did so to assert himself as a capable competitor to Shah Rukh, who ruled from Herat and sought to unify the two halves of the empire. But although these two were opposed, they operated on similar vocabularies of sovereignty. In his Zafarnameh, the famous biography of Timur and Shah Rukh, the astrologer and philosopher Sharafuddin Ali Yazdi spoke of Shah Rukh in glowing terms as a possessor of knowledge and a version of caliphate that owes much to the Neoplatonic Sufi philosophy of Ibn Arabi. So this was a primordial caliphate with authority, like the authority that was first given to Adam, not authority derived from familial proximity to the Prophet Muhammad, as was the paradigm that the Abbasids had. So in this way, the Timurids became spiritual and temporal rulers, effectively saint kings. But the question remains as to how this might relate to governance. In truth, the theory of sacred kingship was never considered to be fully separate from the daily acts of administration. In the political ethical literature of post-Mongol Islam, for instance, the body of the sultan was considered representative or microcosmic of the body politic, society, and the body cosmic, the universe. The creation of a just society was incumbent on justice, or a translation that I like to use, equilibrium, in the person of the sultan, i.e. a sultan could not expect to rule justly if he was not moderate in his behaviors and attributes. Importantly, this way of thinking about the sultan's governance was functionally equivalent to the governance of the saint, who possesses spiritual caliphate,
particularly the kutab or pole who holds the fabric of the universe together. So in short, both sultan and saint, as well as the saint king, were expected to proliferate justice throughout society through proper conduct, ritual action, and self-cultivation at the top of the social hierarchy. In this dynamic, courtly activity is meant to sympathetically produce effects in the real world. The king's realm, in fact, could be divided entirely between an inner court, which is the court proper, and an outer court, everything within the king's domain. World ordering is made possible through human alchemy and theurgy at the level of the sovereign and his courtiers. This kind of administration is what I refer to as microcosmic governance. I suggest that it was prominent across the empires of pre-modern Muslim Asia because it accomplished two things. One, it allowed for the imperial sovereign to be elevated in an absolutist and charismatic fashion as the center of the universe. And two, it imagined an orderly and well-governed domain when bureaucratic, communicative, fiscal, and military control were often sparse or fleeting. So this administrative realization of Timurid political philosophy meshed with other elements of Timurid governance, which I won't get into for time. But finally, we must ask whether any of this holds true for late 15th century Timurid Khorasan under Sultan Hussein Baikara, the final iteration of the Timurids outside of the Mughals in South Asia, who are also Timurids. Sultan Hussein's Herat has been considered by scholars like Maria Sabtuni the peak of the Timurids' Islamization and sedentarization. Herat, in this view, represents the pinnacle of Sharia-based rulership, a renaissance of Islamic art and architecture, and a shift in focus toward agriculture for wealth generation, instead of taxes forbidden by the Sharia. I cannot and nor do I wish to dispute any of these points, but I have wondered in my reading where in the written record and secondary literature on late Timurid Herat is the Baroque political philosophy, overt sacred kingship, and the microcosmic governance that was so prominent among the early Timurids. The truth is that it simply is not there. To my knowledge, it vanishes from the historical record. But while a typical explanation of this lack might concern the supposed turn to Sharia-based legitimacy, let's consider what that might actually mean. So for one example, like that might mean making wine illegal for the common people. These were listed as regulations that they did. Making wine illegal for common people, promoting moral inspection of the markets, patronizing pious Sufi saints, and most importantly, the abolition of non-Islamic taxes. So this is what is actually meant when people talk about the Islamization, like these things that have functional importance, but don't necessarily touch on the actual like political legitimacy. So in brief, I suggest that Timurid Khorasan's Islamization, if we can call it that, and its turn away from sacred kingship were the result of a larger change, the dramatic loss of imperial ambition and competition. Here it is best to remember the direct causes of the development of Timurid sacred kingship, the existence of a vast empire and the heated competition for it among the descendants. In this context, innovations in political philosophy could set you apart from your brother or nephew who also wanted to claim all of the empire. But in the late 15th century, the Timurids of Transoxiana and Khorasan were small states. They had stopped fighting with one another for the most part, and revenue generation by exacting non-Islamic taxes upon conquering a city had become increasingly untenable for an exhausted populace. Troop movements had destroyed too much farmland and infrastructure, and an exhausted populace perhaps could not provide the same degree of manpower as it once could. The Timurids had become provincial governors of far more manageable, smaller territories. They aspired to homeostasis, not to world empire. So to conclude, I would argue that microcosmic governance and the whole edifice of Timurid sacred kingship receded as imperial possibilities were lost. So thank you for your time.
Hello, everyone. This is everyone's nightmare that their presentation just before they're supposed to speak disappears. But thank you for bearing with me and listening to this. So I do have something prepared. I'm normally a pen and paper kind of person, and I think I'll throw my laptop after this. Okay.
Throw it at someone.
Yeah, at Microsoft, whoever. Microsoft. Okay, so can I get the slides, please? It's a Hannah ALPA presentation. If those have also been deleted, then. Yes, excellent. Okay, thank you so much. So This is actually a joint work that I've done with Reza, who's sitting here. So I didn't plagiarize his slides. We just we worked on this together. So in the Q&A, please direct your questions to him. So today, what I'd like to talk about is I'd like to avoid the question of the nation state, actually, by looking at the region, and particularly Khorasan, before Afghanistan was even really an idea, and to look at the difficulties of tracing Khorasan on the map, and the difficulties that modern scholars, medieval scholars, and others have done in understanding it. So first, I'd like to trace how Khorasan developed from a vague designation of the East, the land of the rising sun, into a political and cultural reality. But secondly, to explain why it has remained so difficult to define for us. So next slide, please. Or I can just click it. Is that fine? Oh, thank you. All right. So how and when did our modern idea of Khorasan appear? From Barthold at the start of the 20th century through to scholars in 2019, 2020, scholars have tried to define what Khorasan was and where its boundaries lay, yet their conclusions are strikingly different. I've organized them into two streams of scholarship. One is that thinks of static Khorasan. So this is Khorasan as a place with defined boundaries, different at different points and different periods over the course of 1,000 years, but as static. So this is, I believe, comes from Guy Lestrange's 1905 book, The Lands of the Eastern Caliphate, where he divides it into 4 quarters, that being a Nishapur, Ma'arib, Herat, and Balkh as the centers, bounded by Transoxiana to the north. Other sort of classic scholars like Minorski, Herzfeld follow this pattern. Later in the 1990s, Parvana Pushati distinguished between inner and outer Khorasan, greater, lesser Khorasan. So it's very modern in the past 30 years that we have this distinction. And different scholars have worked with that in different ways. For example, in 2019, Haug folds Khorasan, Transoxiana into a greater Khorasan. And here you can see an example of Guy Lestrange mapping. You can see the province of Khorasan there with some questionable lines through it, through our modern nation states. A second stream was what I call the dynamic Khorasan. So one that does shift across time, although some disagree in the direction of this change. So Bosworth in Encyclopedia of Islam wrote that in early Islam, Khorasan could mean almost everything east of Western Iran, stretching as far as the Indus Valley. But then people disagree about the shades. So did it begin encompassing Transoxiana, like Anne Lemkin said, Sijistan and beyond, but then contracted? That's what a contemporary Iranian journal, the Greater Khorasan Research Journal, also finds. But Rakarante in the edited volume, Greater Khorasan, finds the opposite direction of change, that Khorasan began small as a Khorasan proper and then expanded later. So, and here's a map of Bosworth. You can see Khorasan in the blue. It's this big amorphous section on the left, changes boundaries again in the Seljuk Empire, and then is restricted in the modern sense toward the end of the Cossack period. So, okay, so we can't even agree on where the boundaries are. Were they shrinking? Were they expanding? Were they static dynamic? So part of this problem is not just modern historians. We can also look at medieval geographers who found that they also disagreed, and the disagreements reflected two different traditions, the Iraqi school and the Balkhi school of Islamic geography in the classic period. So the Islamic geographers, writing largely from Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries, continued the Sasanian tradition of dividing the world into quarters or kusts, and Khorasan was the eastern kust, with Baghdad at the center of the world. Here we have Reza's famous maps that he's created, emphasizing the roads and the links between them. So they didn't have a concept of boundaries in the same way that we do. Obviously, they thought of how long it takes to get from one place to another, and we have sort of quarters where everything is. And I'm not going to read through each of the particular geographers. By contrast, the Balkhi school, you can see, I don't know how to make maps. We just have the names of the school. They had a geographic innovation in dividing the world into provinces. So not just generally an area, but the different provinces based on culture, geography, identity to an extent. And they separated Khorasan into its own province and distinguish it from Transoxiana, which is the land beyond the river, beyond the Oxus. And finally, the Hudud al-Alam, they innovated, the anonymous author innovated even further, and instead of looking at provinces or kusts or quarters, potentially she, probably he, looked at the hudud, or the boundaries of the different regions, placing the main cities, the Shaha, and the hudud, the boundaries of Khorasan. And here we have both the boundaries where he said they would be, the Amudarya in the north, the East Hindustan, etc., and then also the main cities that they list, and also the marshes. So there's also maybe not disagreement, but different ways of thinking about the region, even in the time of among contemporaries. So I think we need to go back even further, if you'll continue with me, all the way back through the millennia, because long before the name Khorasan, the region had other designations. In the Avesta, it appears as Bakhti, which is the root of the Achaemenid Bakhtarsha, which was a satrapy of the Achaemenids, centered around the Amudarya. Greek authors called it Bactria, which is Balkh as its capital, which was then inherited by the Kushans, who divided into Bactria and Toharistan, maintaining control on both sides of the Amudarya, which later under the Sasanians became Kushan Shah, which was governed by royal family members styling themselves as Kushan Shah. So this is what Professor Warfield was talking about quite clearly and quite specifically about the local governance, and obviously Reza's paper also. So in this period, the idea of Iran Shah, or the realm of the Iranians, appears on Shahpur's inscription. The idea of Iran Shah originates from the Avesta, but the Sasanians transformed it and applied it to their empire. So an idea became a political and geographic reality in this period. Iran Shah became the main region of the Iranian political and cultural domain, with its core extending from Amudarya to the Euphrates. And Kushan Shah became the eastern part, you can see, of their Iran Shah. And the center remains Balkh, which continues to be the heart of the Eastern Iranian world. I've said that term. And until the middle of the Sasanian period, there was no entity known as Khorasan. I'll briefly just go through what happened next in the interest of time. So from the 4th century onwards, the climactic shifts, and for other reasons, in the Altai Mountains in Central Asia displaced nomadic peoples and confederations, mainly the Kidarites, the Hephthalites, and the Alphans. Collectively, these were known as the Shun, or the Huns, who moved into Bactria, adopting some of the Iranian practices, but had some distinct customs such as skull elongation and shamanic rituals. The Hunnish people moved to Sogdian and Bactria, where they clashed with the Sasanians, and eventually they made an alliance with the Sasanians and helped them in their war against the Romans in Anatolia, and gradually replaced the Kushan Sasanians. And they've minted coins, they produced Bactrian documents, which are quite famous. And in these Bactrian documents, they found there's a new world, Mirasan, which is, here are the coins. We have in this document here on the top right, the Mirasan, meaning the east. So for rulers like the Alkhans north of the Hindu Kush, south of the Hindu Kush, they became the kings of the east as a political statement. And this linguistic innovation would prove foundational, because Mirasan would later be translated into Middle Persian as Khorasan, which is the land where the east of sun rises in Persian. And Reza has talked about this in detail, so I won't go into how it became a province. But basically, we talked about the Sasanians when they have their 4 regions, the Kus. That was because when they defeated the Hephthalites, they reorganized their empire. And Khorasan wasn't just an abstract idea, but they had, or not just symbolism, but because it had its own general, a Spahmed, they had guardians, Marzban for the borders. And unlike the Western regions, which relied on the local Dehkhans, Khorasan was ministered through military offices, underscoring the role as a frontier. And thus, so by the late Sasanian period, Khorasan was an administrative military zone, stretching from Homs to the west and Amudarya in the east. And Reza's talked about the Umayyad province of Khorasan. So when the Arabs come and okay. Okay, okay. So yeah, I'll just skip this part because we've talked about it. But this is the period where Khorasani under the Abbasid revolution also becomes more than just a geography, but also a political and cultural label, which was central to the Abbasid and the Caliphate, the Abbasid and the Caliphate. So. Okay. All right. I won't go through the successor dynasties, although I think they're very interesting. We can talk about in Q&A. I'll just end here, just a run through of some of the conclusions, if this is going to work for me.
It's a mystery where it goes.
Okay, so where was Khorasan really? I think we've made this a long durée survey. And actually, I think the simplest way is to ignore the political and other boundaries and look at the geography, specifically the geology of it. So here you have a map of arable land in the region, with green being irrigated croplands and yellow being rain-fed. And actually, Khorasan is basically wherever you can find melons and saffron growing. And you can find that quite easily. So it's quite a simple solution, but we can think maybe beyond our political and historical labels to understand where Khorasan really was.